Welcome to Shadows of America, where history's darkest secrets come to light. In the winter of 1894, on the remote Matinicus Rock Lighthouse station 25 miles off the coast of Maine, lighthouse keeper Daniel Whitmore was found dead in his quarters from what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds. Whitmore had served as keeper of the isolated lighthouse for 11 years, living alone on the barren rock island for months at a time, with only occasional supply visits connecting him to the mainland. His death seemed to be another tragic case of a solitary man succumbing to the psychological strain of extreme isolation in one of the most remote lighthouse postings in America. But when the relief keeper arrived to assume duties and to prepare Whitmore's effects for shipment to his family, he discovered something that suggested Whitmore's death might not have been simple suicide from loneliness. Hidden throughout Whitmore's living quarters were dozens of journals filled with detailed transcriptions of voices that Whitmore claimed to have heard at the lighthouse over his 11 years of service. The journals documented thousands of conversations, monologues, and utterances that Whitmore had recorded with obsessive precision, noting the date, time, weather conditions, and exact location where each voice had been heard. The disturbing aspect of these journals was that Whitmore had been the only person stationed at Matinicus Rock Lighthouse. There should have been no voices for him to hear and to transcribe. The lighthouse was located on a small barren rock island, with no other structures, no other inhabitants, and no reason for anyone to visit except the quarterly supply boats that arrived briefly and departed. Yet Whitmore's journals documented voices speaking to him daily, sometimes hourly, carrying on conversations with him and with each other, creating an impossible auditory environment that Whitmore had spent 11 years documenting in meticulous detail. The journals raised terrifying questions. Had Daniel Whitmore experienced auditory hallucinations for 11 years? Hearing voices that didn't exist while faithfully transcribing them? Had the extreme isolation of lighthouse keeping driven him insane, while he continued performing his duties competently enough that no one noticed his deteriorating mental state? Or had something genuinely impossible occurred at Matinicus Rock? Had voices without sources been speaking to a lighthouse keeper alone, on a barren rock, creating an inexplicable phenomenon that drove Whitmore to document what he was experiencing, even though he knew no one would believe him? The journals contained what Whitmore described as conversations with drowning sailors, calling for help from ships that had sunk decades before his arrival, with the voices of children who claimed to be lost, with women asking for directions to shore that didn't exist, with men discussing navigation and weather in archaic maritime language. Whitmore documented his responses to these voices, his attempts to help them, and his growing realization that the voices couldn't be real, but that he couldn't stop hearing them, regardless of what logic told him. Before we continue with the complete investigation into Daniel Whitmore and the 11 years he spent alone on Matinicus Rock recording voices that shouldn't have existed, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries daily, because what was found in those journals raises profound questions about isolation, sanity, and whether the human mind can create entire worlds of sound when deprived of genuine human contact for too long. Matinicus Rock Lighthouse, located approximately 25 miles southeast of Rockland, Maine, was one of the most isolated and challenging lighthouse postings in the United States Lighthouse Service. The station consisted of 2 lighthouse towers on a small barren granite island, measuring only 32 acres, with no trees, minimal vegetation, and no protection from Atlantic storms that regularly swept across the exposed rock. The lighthouse had been established in 1827 to warn ships away from the dangerous rocks and to mark the approach to Penobscot Bay. Lighthouse keeping on Matinicus Rock was notoriously difficult. The isolation was extreme. Keepers lived on the rock for 6 to 9 months at a time between supply visits, with only occasional mail delivery and no means of leaving except when supply boats arrived. The weather was harsh, with winter storms sometimes lasting for days and making outdoor work dangerous or impossible. The living quarters were Spartan, the work was repetitive and demanding, and the psychological strain of complete isolation led to high turnover, as keepers either requested transfer after brief postings or left the lighthouse service entirely. Daniel Whitmore had been appointed keeper of Matinicus Rock in 1883 at age 35, after serving as assistant keeper at several other Maine lighthouses. His appointment records described him as competent, reliable, and willing to accept the challenging posting that many keepers avoided. Whitmore was unmarried, had no close family, and apparently viewed the isolation of Matinicus Rock as acceptable given the higher pay and the autonomy that came with being sole keeper of a two-tower station. His initial reports to lighthouse service supervisors were professional and indicated no problems with the posting, but Whitmore's journals, which began within weeks of his arrival at Matinicus Rock, tell a different story. The first journal entry, dated April 1883, describes hearing someone calling for help during his evening inspection of the lighthouse grounds. Whitmore searched the rocks thoroughly, assuming someone from a passing boat had been stranded or that a swimmer was in distress, but he found no one, and when he looked out to sea, there were no boats visible in any direction. The voice had seemed to come from directly behind him, clear and urgent, but when he turned, there was nothing there but empty rock. Over the following weeks, Whitmore documented more incidents of hearing voices. Someone would call his name when he was alone in the lighthouse tower. He would hear conversations between multiple people discussing maritime matters when he was the only person on the island. He would hear singing, crying, praying, and cursing coming from various locations around the rock, but when he investigated he would find nothing. Initially, Whitmore attributed these experiences to the wind creating acoustic effects, or to his mind playing tricks as it adjusted to the isolation. But as the voices became more frequent and more detailed, he began to accept that he was experiencing something that couldn't be explained by wind or imagination. By the end of his first year on Matinicus Rock, Whitmore had begun the systematic documentation that would continue for the next 10 years. He recorded every voice he heard, transcribing what was said as accurately as he could, noting the time and location and weather conditions. He attempted to identify patterns. Did the voices occur more frequently during storms, at certain times of day, in particular locations on the rock? Did they say consistent things, or were they random? Were they the same voices recurring, or different voices each time? Whitmore's journals show him treating the voices as a phenomenon to be studied and documented even as he struggled to understand what was happening to him. The content of the voices Whitmore recorded was predominantly maritime in nature. He documented sailors calling out bearings and depths as if navigating ships through dangerous waters. He recorded conversations between crew members, discussing storms and cargo and destinations. He transcribed prayers and final words that seemed to come from people drowning or from people on sinking ships. Many of the voices used nautical terminology and references that were outdated by 1880 standards, suggesting speech patterns from earlier decades or centuries. Whitmore, who had extensive maritime experience, could often identify the specific sailing maneuvers or navigation techniques the voices were describing, lending strange authenticity to what he was hearing. But the voices weren't exclusively maritime. Whitmore documented hearing children's voices asking where their parents were, women's voices calling for help or searching for lost family members, men's voices discussing farming and trade that had no connection to seafaring. These non-maritime voices were less frequent than the sailor voices, but were equally detailed and equally impossible given that Whitmore was alone on a barren rock with no civilian population anywhere nearby. Whitmore's journals document his attempts to interact with the voices. He would respond to calls for help, shouting directions to shore or offering assistance, even though he knew there was no one there to hear him or to help. He would answer questions posed by the voices, carrying on one-sided conversations that his journals record in dialogue format. The voice's question or statement, followed by Whitmore's response, followed by the voice's reply. These transcribed conversations show Whitmore trying to determine whether the voices were aware of him, whether they could hear his responses, or whether they were simply repeating phrases without consciousness or interaction. The answer appeared to be inconsistent. Sometimes the voices seemed to respond appropriately to what Whitmore said, as if they were genuine entities capable of hearing him and engaging in conversation. Other times the voices seemed to be recordings or echoes, repeating the same phrases regardless of what Whitmore said to them. This inconsistency troubled Whitmore deeply, as documented in his journal entries, where he tried to develop theories about what he was experiencing. Were these ghosts of people who had died at sea, somehow trapped in repetitive patterns around the lighthouse? Were they hallucinations that sometimes incorporated his own responses and sometimes didn't? Were they something else entirely, some phenomenon beyond his ability to categorize or understand? The psychological toll on Whitmore was evident in his journal's progression over 11 years. The early entries were clinical and relatively emotionless, treating the voices as curiosities to be documented. But as years passed, and as the voices continued and intensified, Whitmore's writing became more agitated and more desperate. He described the voices as constant companions that prevented him from ever feeling truly alone, but that also prevented him from experiencing normal silence or solitude. He wrote about how the voices made sleep difficult because they didn't stop at night, how they made concentration on his lighthouse duties challenging because they were always present in the background, creating distraction. By 1890, 7 years into his posting, Whitmore's journals documented that he was hearing voices almost continuously during his waking hours. The lighthouse station had become, in his experience, a place of constant auditory activity, where invisible people were perpetually speaking, calling, singing, and conversing around him. He described the experience as like living in a crowded city while being completely alone, surrounded by sound and apparent human presence, while knowing intellectually that he was the only person on the rock. The content of the voices began to change during Whitmore's later years at the lighthouse. In addition to the maritime and lost person voices he had heard since the beginning, he began documenting voices that spoke directly to him about his situation. These voices would comment on his documentation project, asking why he was recording them, or expressing awareness that he was listening to them. They would discuss Whitmore himself, describing his appearance or his routines in ways that suggested they could see him, even though he couldn't see them. These personal voices disturbed Whitmore more than the impersonal maritime voices had, suggesting either that his hallucinations were becoming more elaborate, or that whatever was generating the voices was becoming more aware of him. The lighthouse service supervisors, who made quarterly inspection visits to Matinicus Rock, noted no problems with Whitmore's performance of his duties during most of his 11-year tenure. His lighthouse log entries were professional and complete, the station was maintained properly, the lights and fog signals operated reliably, and Whitmore appeared physically healthy, if somewhat withdrawn and uncommunicative during the brief visits. The supervisors attributed his reserved demeanor to the natural effects of isolation, rather than to serious psychological problems, and they had no reason to review his personal journals or to understand the extent of his auditory experiences. But in 1893, during a full inspection visit, supervisors noted that Whitmore appeared more agitated and less coherent than in previous visits. He made oblique references to the voices and to the difficulty of maintaining the lighthouse with so many people around constantly. The supervisors were concerned but not alarmed enough to remove Whitmore from duty immediately. They suggested he consider requesting a transfer to a less isolated posting, and they made note to pay closer attention during the next quarterly visit. That next visit didn't occur. In January 1894, harsh winter storms prevented the scheduled supply boat from reaching Matinicus Rock for several months beyond the normal interval. When the boat finally reached the lighthouse in March 1894, the crew found that Daniel Whitmore had died approximately 2 months earlier, based on the condition of his body and the date of his final journal entry. He had inflicted multiple wounds on himself, suggesting he had experienced prolonged suffering before dying. The scene suggested not a quick impulsive suicide, but a prolonged deterioration where Whitmore had harmed himself repeatedly over days or weeks before finally dying. The relief keeper who arrived with the supply boat discovered Whitmore's journals while packing his personal effects. The sheer volume was startling: dozens of journals, thousands of pages, representing 11 years of obsessive documentation. The relief keeper read portions of the journals and immediately recognized that they documented something extraordinary and disturbing. He preserved all the journals and submitted them to the Lighthouse service along with his report about Whitmore's death. The Lighthouse service investigation into Whitmore's death concluded that he had experienced a psychotic break resulting from the extreme isolation of his posting, that the voices he documented were auditory hallucinations, and that his death by self-inflicted wounds was the tragic result of deteriorating mental health that had gone undetected for too long. The investigation recommended more frequent psychological evaluation of keepers at isolated postings and suggested that maximum continuous posting durations be established to prevent excessive isolation exposure. But the investigation didn't fully address the question of how Whitmore had continued performing his lighthouse duties competently for 11 years, while apparently experiencing constant auditory hallucinations. Psychotic breaks severe enough to generate the elaborate and detailed hallucinations Whitmore documented typically also impair normal functioning. Yet Whitmore's lighthouse log and the condition of the station suggested his professional performance had remained adequate until the final months. This discrepancy led some to question whether Whitmore's experiences might have been something other than simple hallucination, though the Lighthouse service officially rejected any supernatural interpretation. The journals were examined by several doctors and psychologists interested in isolation-induced mental illness. Their assessment was that Whitmore had likely experienced a gradual onset of schizophrenia, or a similar psychotic disorder, exacerbated by the extreme isolation of his posting. The voices he heard were explained as auditory hallucinations generated by a brain deprived of normal social stimulation, creating phantom conversations and human presence to compensate for the absence of real human contact. The maritime content of many voices was explained as Whitmore's mind drawing on his extensive sailing knowledge to create convincing and detailed hallucinations consistent with his environment and experience. But some aspects of Whitmore's journals troubled the medical experts. The linguistic complexity and historical accuracy of some of the voices Whitmore recorded exceeded what would be expected from hallucinations drawing on his personal knowledge. He documented nautical terminology and navigation techniques that were obsolete by the 1880s, phrases in foreign languages he apparently didn't speak, and references to specific historical ships and events that he had no obvious way of knowing about. Some of these details were later verified as historically accurate through maritime archives, raising questions about how Whitmore's hallucinations could contain accurate information he didn't consciously possess. One theory proposed that Whitmore might have had access to historical maritime documents, or might have heard stories from old sailors earlier in his career, and that his mind was retrieving this half-forgotten knowledge and incorporating it into his hallucinations in ways that made the voices seem more authentic than they actually were. This theory was plausible but couldn't be definitively proven, leaving some uncertainty about whether all of Whitmore's documented voices could be fully explained as internal mental phenomena versus possibly having some external component. The question of whether other lighthouse keepers at isolated postings experience similar auditory phenomena was investigated after Whitmore's death. The Lighthouse Service reviewed reports and journals from keepers at other remote stations, looking for references to hearing voices or experiencing auditory hallucinations. They found that several other keepers had reported hearing voices or unexplained sounds, though none had documented their experiences as extensively as Whitmore had. These reports suggested that isolation-induced auditory experiences might be relatively common among lighthouse keepers at remote postings, even if most keepers didn't develop the systematic documentation habit that Whitmore had or didn't experience phenomena as severe and sustained. Modern psychological understanding of isolation effects provides frameworks for explaining Whitmore's experiences that weren't available in 1894. Extended isolation can produce various perceptual distortions, including auditory and visual hallucinations, as the brain attempts to maintain normal patterns of stimulation and social engagement despite the absence of actual social input. The phenomenon of hearing voices is particularly common in isolation situations, with the brain essentially generating simulated social interactions when real ones aren't available. Whitmore's case represents an extreme example of this phenomenon, but it falls within recognized patterns of how isolation affects perception. However, the specific content and consistency of Whitmore's voices, the recurring themes, the coherent conversations, the accurate historical details goes beyond what simple sensory deprivation typically produces. Most isolation-induced hallucinations are fragmentary and inconsistent, reflecting the random firing of understimulated neural circuits. Whitmore's voices showed structure and content that suggested either more complex psychological processes or possibly the incorporation of real environmental sounds that he was misinterpreting as voices. The acoustic properties of the lighthouse station, with its hollow tower structures and rocky surroundings, could have created echoes and resonances that Whitmore's isolated mind interpreted as human voices, adding apparent external validation to what were primarily internal experiences. The final entries in Whitmore's journals, written in the weeks before his death in January 1894, show severe deterioration in his mental state. His handwriting became less controlled, his entries became more fragmented and less coherent, and the content shifted from documentation of voices to expressions of despair and to pleas for the voices to stop. He wrote repeatedly about being unable to tolerate the constant noise anymore, about feeling trapped in endless conversation with people who weren't real, about wanting silence and peace that he couldn't achieve even when alone on an isolated rock in the middle of the ocean. One of the final entries reads, "They never stop. Even when I can see there is no one here, I hear them speaking. Even when I cover my ears, I hear them inside my head. They are not real, but they are also not real. I cannot explain this to anyone who has not heard them. I am so tired." This entry captures the essential tragedy of Whitmore's situation. He was aware that the voices couldn't be real. He understood intellectually that he was experiencing something generated by his own mind, but this knowledge didn't make the voices stop or make them less overwhelming. The Lighthouse Service's decision about what to do with Whitmore's journals was debated. Some officials argued for destroying them to protect Whitmore's reputation and to prevent the journals from being sensationalized or misused. Others argued for preserving them as potentially valuable medical documentation of isolation effects on mental health. Eventually, the journals were preserved in Lighthouse Service archives with restricted access, where they remained largely forgotten for decades, until historians researching Lighthouse history rediscovered them in the mid-20th century. Modern scholars who have studied Whitmore's journals have been struck by their literary quality and their psychological depth. Despite documenting experiences that were likely hallucinations, the journals read as compelling accounts of attempting to make sense of inexplicable phenomena, of trying to maintain rationality and professional competence while experiencing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Whitmore's careful documentation, his attempts to find patterns and explanations, and his gradual recognition that he couldn't trust his own perceptions, create a narrative of psychological deterioration that is both disturbing and deeply human. The question of whether Whitmore could have been helped if his condition had been recognized earlier is unanswerable but poignant. If supervisors had understood that he was experiencing severe auditory hallucinations during their quarterly visits, they could have relieved him from duty and potentially provided treatment that might have prevented his death. But Whitmore's competent performance of his duties and his reluctance to reveal the full extent of his experiences meant that warning signs weren't obvious to observers who spent limited time with him. His isolation itself prevented the kinds of extended observation that might have made his deteriorating condition apparent. The impact of extreme isolation on mental health was not well understood in the late 19th century, and lighthouse keepers were expected to tolerate isolation as a routine aspect of their work. The assumption was that psychologically healthy men could handle extended solitude without significant problems, and that anyone who couldn't handle isolation was simply unsuited for lighthouse work and should seek other employment. Whitmore's case challenged this assumption by demonstrating that even previously stable individuals could develop severe psychological problems when exposed to sufficient isolation for sufficient duration. The maritime folklore about ghosts and spirits around lighthouses and shipwreck sites provided an alternative framework for interpreting Whitmore's experiences that he himself occasionally referenced in his journals. Many sailors and lighthouse keepers believed that the souls of drowned sailors remained near the sites of their deaths, and that lighthouses, being places where ships often wrecked, would naturally be populated by such spirits. Whitmore sometimes wrote about whether the voices he heard might be actual ghosts rather than hallucinations, expressing ambivalence about which explanation would be worse, being haunted by real spirits or being driven mad by isolation. Modern paranormal investigators and enthusiasts have seized on Whitmore's journals as potential evidence of genuine supernatural phenomena, arguing that the detailed and consistent nature of his experiences suggests something beyond hallucination. They point to the historically accurate information in some of the voices, to the apparent interactions between Whitmore and the voices, and to reports from subsequent lighthouse keepers at Matinicus Rock, who also claimed to hear unexplained sounds, as evidence that Whitmore might have been experiencing genuine paranormal activity rather than mental illness. But these paranormal interpretations must be weighed against the more parsimonious psychological explanation that Whitmore experienced severe isolation-induced psychosis that produced detailed and consistent hallucinations, drawing on his maritime knowledge and incorporating information he had been exposed to but hadn't consciously remembered. This explanation accounts for all the documented evidence without requiring acceptance of unproven supernatural phenomena, making it more scientifically credible, even if less exciting than ghost theories. The few photographs that exist of Daniel Whitmore show a serious man with weathered features and an intense gaze, looking older than his chronological age. The photographs were taken during his early years at Matinicus Rock, before the worst of his psychological deterioration. There are no photographs from his final years, so visual documentation of how his appearance changed as his condition worsened doesn't exist. But the written descriptions from the last inspection visit before his death describe him as gaunt, exhausted, and anxious, suggesting visible physical effects of his psychological struggles. The lighthouse station at Matinicus Rock continued operating after Whitmore's death, with a succession of keepers serving relatively short postings before requesting transfers. Several subsequent keepers reported hearing unexplained sounds or voices, though none documented their experiences as extensively as Whitmore had. Whether these later keepers were influenced by knowledge of Whitmore's experiences, whether they too developed isolation-induced hallucinations, or whether there might be something about the acoustic properties of the station that generates anomalous sounds, remains unclear. The lighthouse was automated in 1990 and is no longer staffed by resident keepers, ending the era of human isolation at the station. Whitmore's family, who received his personal effects, including his journals, were devastated by learning about his experiences and his suffering. They had known he was serving at a remote lighthouse, but had not understood the psychological toll the posting was taking on him. The journals revealed that Whitmore had experienced severe distress for years while maintaining a facade of professional competence, suffering in isolation without asking for help or making his struggles known. This tragic pattern of suffering in silence, while maintaining appearances, was unfortunately common among lighthouse keepers and others in isolated professions who feared that admitting to psychological struggles would end their careers. The legacy of Whitmore's case includes improved recognition of isolation's psychological effects and better support systems for people in isolated professions. Modern military personnel, researchers in remote locations, and others who work in isolation receive psychological screening, regular mental health check-ins, and support services that weren't available in Whitmore's era. While isolation-induced mental health problems still occur, they are more likely to be identified and addressed before reaching the severity that Whitmore experienced. The journals themselves remain preserved in archives, accessible to researchers studying lighthouse history, isolation psychology, or auditory hallucination phenomena. Reading Whitmore's careful daily documentation of voices that likely didn't exist outside his own mind creates an eerie experience. The journals read as convincing accounts of real experiences, and only external knowledge that Whitmore was alone prevents readers from accepting the voices as real. This quality makes the journals valuable for understanding how subjectively real hallucinations can feel to those experiencing them, and why people experiencing psychosis often cannot distinguish their altered perceptions from reality. The memorial to Daniel Whitmore, placed at the Maine Lighthouse Museum in Rockland, acknowledges his 11 years of service at Matinicus Rock and his death while on duty, but makes no mention of the voices or his journals. The memorial presents him as a dedicated lighthouse keeper who served faithfully in a challenging posting, which was true even if it omits the full complexity of his experience. This sanitized memorial reflects tension between honoring Whitmore's service and protecting his privacy regarding his mental health struggles. The question of what Whitmore would have wanted done with his journals, whether he would have wanted them preserved and studied or destroyed to keep his experiences private, cannot be answered. He never expressed clear preferences about the journal's future, and his death by self-inflicted wounds suggests he may not have been thinking clearly about such matters in his final weeks. The decision to preserve them has allowed his experiences to contribute to understanding of isolation and mental health, but it has also meant his psychological struggles became public record rather than remaining private suffering. Modern lighthouse enthusiasts and historians who visit Matinicus Rock sometimes report feeling uneasy at the location, though whether this reflects something about the location itself or simply the psychological effect of knowing Whitmore's story is impossible to determine. The lighthouse remains standing, now automated and maintained remotely, the isolated rock where Whitmore spent 11 years hearing voices and documenting them in journals that revealed both his deteriorating sanity and his persistent attempts to understand and document what he was experiencing. Daniel Whitmore's 11 years at Matinicus Rock, Lighthouse recording voices that may or may not have existed outside his own mind, represents one of the most detailed documented cases of isolation-induced auditory experiences in American history. Whether the voices were hallucinations generated by a brain deprived of social contact, whether they were misinterpretations of natural sounds in an acoustically strange environment, or whether they represented something genuinely inexplicable, Whitmore's careful documentation provides invaluable insight into the subjective experience of hearing voices and of trying to maintain functioning while reality itself seems uncertain. The more than 30 journals Whitmore filled with transcriptions of voices, along with his attempts to analyze and understand what he was experiencing, stand as testament to one man's struggle to maintain his grip on reality while experiencing something that defied his understanding. His death alone on that isolated rock, surrounded by journals documenting years of impossible conversations, represents a profound tragedy of isolation, of suffering born in silence, and of the human mind's vulnerability when deprived of the social connections that help ground us in shared reality. What happened to Daniel Whitmore at Matinicus Rock between 1883 and 1894, whether he experienced progressive psychosis that generated elaborate auditory hallucinations, or whether he experienced something genuinely anomalous that drove him to document what he heard, despite knowing no one would believe him, remains uncertain. What is certain is that he spent 11 years hearing voices that compelled his attention, that he documented those voices with meticulous care, and that he ultimately couldn't survive the burden of living in a world where he was perpetually surrounded by sounds of human presence, while being utterly alone.